You overheard our conversation yesterday, didn't you? My eldest son and his wife are returning home for the birth of their child. So, I need you to clear your stuff up to the yard. Excuse me, but you can't have kids anyway. You'll even help with my son's work. The least you could do is make some room. I'm paying $10,000 in rent, and this is getting too tiresome to deal with. I've been living with my mother-in-law, but now she wants me out of the house because my brother-in-law and his wife are returning. Between my mother-in-law, brother-in-law, his wife, and my husband, this house is full of problems. I've been trying to keep things running smoothly, but it's becoming a hassle to think about it all. I'm done thinking. Okay, I'll leave, but I can't just put my belongings in the yard. So I'll come back later to pick them up. You're leaving? Thank you, that's a big help. Ignoring my pleas, my mother-in-law, I started packing my things and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called the junk removal service. Once I stopped thinking, no one could stop my actions. I'm Linda, a 40-year-old IT consultant. My husband, Mark, is also 40 and runs 3 restaurants as a sole proprietor. We're both 40 and people often assume we've been married a long time and have a kid or two, but we're actually newlyweds. We both live as workaholics and didn't marry until this age. I had given up on marriage just before turning 40, but a random visit to a bar after work changed my mind. This your first time here? Mark asked. Yes, that's right, I replied. Feeling comfortable in Mark's restaurant, I started visiting frequently as a regular. I always sat at the end of the bar, and it became normal for Mark to chat with me while I ate. What does an IT consultant do? Mark asked. Introducing it to companies, strategic planning. I've worked with restaurants too. Once I suggested a tablet-based ordering system to reduce labor costs and improve efficiency, I replied. Slowly, I was drawn to his dedication to his work. And likewise, Mark grew fond of me, seeing that I was a hard-working person. I'm always busy with work and can't talk much. How about we go out for dinner sometime? Mark suggested. Excited about the chance to dine with a restaurateur, I eagerly agreed. We started dating, and 2 years later, as we both turned 40, we decided to get married. Feeling shy about being a bride at 40, I asked my husband to skip the wedding ceremony and we just took some photos of us dressed up. After we got married, I moved from my apartment to my husband's house, a 3-story building with a garden and parking located in a high-end area. The rent is apparently around $10,000. Some might think it's unthinkable to live with a mother-in-law right after getting married, but I'm 40, so I don't mind much. Plus, my mother-in-law is 70 and my father-in-law has passed away, so living together seemed necessary when my husband suggested it. I immediately agreed, but after moving in with my mother-in-law, I regretted accepting so quickly. When I moved into my husband's house, besides the bedroom for us, I even got a lavish office room for myself. His house seemed too big for just 2 people, with many spare rooms. Once I settled in, I asked my husband a simple question. Why do we need such a big house just for you and your mother? I have a brother 3 years older than me. He left home after college, and I've lost touch with him for the most part. He hasn't been home at all, and it's been a few years since I've heard from him. He's such a man that one day he might get into trouble and come back to me and Mom, right? So we decided to rent a bigger house, my husband explained. I think it's a little too big, I said. Well, I got married, and you came, so I guess it all worked out, my husband said with a smile as he unboxed my books and arranged them on the shelf. He talked about his brother Daniel from his story. It seems Daniel is aimlessly hopping from job to job, but my husband doesn't think badly of him. Don't talk about that kid. What if he really comes back? My mother-in-law appeared at the doorway of what would be my office, seemingly checking on us. It appears she doesn't have a good opinion of him, unlike my husband. It's understandable for a mother to show a cold reaction to an eldest son who shirks his responsibilities. However, I'm worried that my husband and my mother-in-law might clash over his brother someday. Also, I'm not too fond of you either, Mom. Come on, we're going to live together now, so stop saying things like that, I said. I'm not saying you should leave. I just need to make things clear from the start. My mother-in-law walked away, her slippers making a padding sound. I'm sorry, I'll talk to her, my husband said. It's okay. I got a similar talk when we met for the wedding. I'll build a relationship with your mother as we live together, I replied. I took a book from my husband's paused hands and placed it on the shelf. It seems she doesn't like my age. I'm 40, so it's not impossible to have children, but I guess it's a challenging thought. Also, Mark's elder brother Daniel is not married and has no children, so there's a high chance that my mother-in-law won't get to see her grandchildren. That's why she's disappointed and wishes Mark had married someone younger. To her, Daniel, who doesn't fulfill his role as the eldest son, and I, who can't fulfill my role as a wife in her eyes, are probably the same. I understand her feelings, but I can't turn back the clock on my body, so there's nothing I can do about that one. Once the move was completely finished, and our married life officially began, my mother-in-law's coldness towards me became evident. She ignored or avoided me when I spoke and tried to have as little to do with me as possible. It's a bit lonely, but since there's no harassment or physical violence, I guess I should consider it okay for now. I can build a relationship with her over time, but more pressing is my concern for Mark. Are you okay with your work? I asked him. No, it's pretty bad. I need to take action soon, but it's tough to arrange the finances, Mark replied, sitting at the dining table with his head in his hands. I stopped doing the dishes and sat down in front of him to listen. These are tough times. Prices are soaring, expenses climbing, and customers are tightening their wallets. There's no end in sight if this keeps up. We might have to close another one of our stores, Mark continued. About a year into our marriage, the situation at Mark's restaurants worsened. One of the 3 stores had already closed, and it seemed another might have to shut down too. Seeing Mark's troubled face made me feel distressed, but my mother-in-law seemed unaffected by these troubles. You're Mark's wife, but you don't help out at the store. You just do your own job. Can you really say you're fulfilling your role as a wife? My mother-in-law's voice pierced through the air from the living room as she overheard our conversation. I wondered what she was thinking, but she has her own way of seeing things. Mark has been running his own restaurant for nearly 10 years, overcoming various challenges. I believe he'll pull through this time too. You, his wife, shouldn't be making that face. Are you trying to feed into his anxiety and make him fail? What a terrible wife, she shouted again, her words filled with spite and venom. I knew she wasn't just trying to fire me up, but she wasn't entirely wrong. I took her words positively and decided to support Mark to the fullest, smiling reassuringly at my anxious husband. A year later, just as she said, Mark managed to turn this situation around and avoided closing a second store. See, I told you, I said to my mother-in-law. A stupid wife who can't even trust her husband. Don't drag Mark down, she replied, lashing out at me without reservation. The relationship with her might seem to have worsened, but since Mark's business is doing well, I'll consider it a break-even situation. I thought things were balancing out, but it turned out to be a clear negative for me. Mark. Daniel called for my brother. My mother-in-law suddenly said. Yes, Daniel's girlfriend is pregnant. That's great news. She's a 32-year-old who worked at the same bar as Mark. They asked. Something. Why are you being so formal all of a sudden? I asked. Daniel is a freelancer and so is his pregnant girlfriend. With a baby on the way, they're struggling. They asked if they could move into this house and if they could work at your restaurant, my mother-in-law explained. I was contemplating how to confront Mark about the affair from the dining room when my mother-in-law came into the living room and started talking to him. The conversation was about Daniel, whom I've never met, and I was completely left out as they continued talking. It was a strange scene. She used to dislike Daniel for not fulfilling his role as the eldest son, yet now she was asking Mark to welcome him. The reason was simple, the grandchild. She had given up hope of seeing a grandchild, and now saw an opportunity and completely changed her stance. She was even planning to offer them a home and jobs. Ah, okay. Mark finally replied, looking back at me with a clearly troubled expression. Come on, it's a good thing. Daniel is in trouble and you, Mark, have the means to help him, my mother-in-law said. I felt a sense of unease. Is it not odd to have Daniel and his family move in? I looked at Mark in the living room from the dining area, and he seemed to share my concern. But with my mother-in-law's sudden decision, it seemed we were both in for some unexpected changes. I grappled with Mark's inability to say no to his mother. I had hoped he would stand up to her, but it seems it was just wishful thinking. He kept glancing at me, probably worried about my reaction. The worsening relationship with my mother-in-law, Mark's affair, now living with Daniel and his family, the problems just kept piling up. Overwhelmed and not knowing where to start, I decided to abandon thinking for today and just go to sleep. The next day being a holiday and probably due to extreme mental fatigue, I slept in until late morning. Mark was at work, so it was just my mother-in-law and me at home. Dreading what she might say about my sleeping in, I reluctantly headed to the living room. "You sure slept in. Must be nice to have such leisure," she said, surpassing my expectations. "You heard Mark and me talking yesterday, right? Daniel and his wife are coming back for a maternity leave visit, so move your stuff up to the yard." Excuse me, I was still groggy from sleep. Did she really mean I should live in the yard, or was she telling me to leave the house? "You can't have kids anyway. You don't help with Mark's work, so you should at least make room for Daniel and his family. We have 2 spare rooms left, so if you leave and your office is free, we can have a bedroom and a nursery for Daniel's family and a storage room for their stuff. Don't you think the room count and usage are just perfect?" It seems she was indeed telling me to leave, but a storage room for Daniel's family. I'm being kicked out to make room for a space that doesn't seem necessary. Originally, I was allowed to use the office because there were spare rooms, and I don't mind if it's gone. A bedroom for Mark and me is enough. Daniel's family can live here without me leaving. Realizing that my mother-in-law now sees no reason for me to be in this house as a wife since she can see her grandchild and I'm paying $10,000 in rent, I'm too tired to deal with all this. I decided to clear my mind and give my brain a rest. Silent with my mother-in-law, the only sound in the living room was the ticking of the clock. "Okay, time to leave," I said, having rested my mind. I decided it's too much trouble to worry about what happens to Mark, my mother-in-law, Daniel's family, and their future. "Understood. I'll leave. I can't put all my belongings in the yard, so I'll come back later to pick them up," I declared. "You're leaving? Thank you, that helps," my pleased mother-in-law said, ignoring my words. I started packing my things and left the house. 7 seconds after stepping out the door, I took out my phone and called a junk removal service. My decision, made after stopping my overthinking, couldn't be stopped by anyone. Let them all regret this choice later. Having left the house, I decided to stay at a hotel for the time being. I had called the junk removal service, but they needed some time to prepare. This worked out since I wanted some time too. 2 weeks after leaving, I rented an apartment and started living alone. I haven't heard from Mark since then. He probably thinks I'll come back eventually. The thought of Mark taking the current situation lightly infuriates me. However, today is the day after his restaurant's day off. I expect a call from Mark when he visits the restaurant for a lunch prep. "Hey, what's going on here?" "The restaurant is completely empty," Mark exclaimed over the phone. Just as I thought, I chuckled. "Mark, I could explain over the phone, but it would be more efficient if your mom was there too. I'm heading to the house now. Can you come back? You could open the restaurant anyway, right?" I couldn't help but laugh before hanging up, amused by Mark's reaction. What on earth is this? The restaurant's fridge, cooking equipment, tables, all the important stuff is gone. Did you do this? Do you think you can get away with this for free? As soon as I arrived at the house, my mother-in-law started yelling at me. It seems Mark had explained half of the situation. There was an unfamiliar couple in the living room, apparently Daniel and his wife. They looked confused and anxious, not fully grasping the situation and my mother-in-law's extreme anger. "It's my restaurant, so there shouldn't be a problem with me starting the closing process or having the items I bought disposed of by a junk removal service, right?" I countered. "Huh? Your restaurant? What are you talking about? Why don't you explain, Mark? You haven't told your mom, have you? You remember that I still have the main restaurant and the second branch, and the second one was in a financial crisis, right?" Mark began. "Yes, of course. You worked hard to turn it around, changing the tables, chairs, signboard, the restaurant's atmosphere, bringing in new cooking equipment, expanding the menu, and replacing the fridge and freezer to accommodate the new menu, right?" My mother-in-law nodded. "Well, about that, Linda actually paid for those expenses," Mark confessed. Hearing Mark's words, my mother-in-law looked perplexed. She seemed to be trying hard to understand but probably lacked the full information to grasp everything. Mark continued, looking uncomfortable, as if he was holding back a bathroom break. Seeing that this was going nowhere, I decided to explain. Before turning 40, I was single and working in night consulting. We didn't have a wedding ceremony, nor did we buy a new house after getting married, so I had saved up quite a bit of money. I lent Mark $200,000 to help turn around his struggling second restaurant branch. $200,000? But you can't just hand over such a large amount of money to your spouse, right? My mother-in-law exclaimed. That's why I decided to buy the rights to the second branch and become its owner, I explained. I left most of the management to Mark, so there wasn't much for me to do as the owner. The only change was that Mark shifted his focus from the main branch to the second one for its recovery. When Mark's restaurant was in crisis, I had to show my concern alongside him. It was when my mother-in-law yelled at me for not showing enough trust in my husband that I decided to support Mark to the fullest. My form of support was giving him the money I had saved during my single years. Mark, is this true? My mother-in-law asked. Yeah, it's true. She said it was okay if I failed and wasted the $200,000. She gave me the money, but since it was such a large amount, it was going to fail anyway. She suggested becoming the owner. The plan was to pay back the borrowed $200,000 from the restaurant's earnings. But it was simpler for Linda to become the owner and have the restaurant's income go directly to her. It also meant that she could decide whether to close the restaurant or not. It's a lie. Can something like that really happen? My mother-in-law exclaimed. I understand it's hard to believe hearing this all of a sudden. That's why I brought some evidence, I said, spreading documents like the business license transfer of rights agreement and lease agreement on the table, proving that I was the owner of the restaurant. My mother-in-law's face turned red as she confirmed my name on those documents. Why didn't you say anything about this? You always talked about how you believed in Mark and how the restaurant was recovering, right? She demanded. Even before we got married, you always encouraged Mark like that. He felt pressured by your words but tried to live up to your expectations. Not wanting to disappoint you as the head of the household, you're pretty cold to people like me and Daniel who don't fulfill their roles, right? That's why Mark couldn't tell you he borrowed a large sum of money from me. He could have just told me. That's why Mark couldn't speak his mind, because you get upset easily. People like my mother-in-law often don't realize they're putting pressure on others. They might think it's just a small thing to say, but for the one under pressure, it's a huge burden. Not something they can easily talk about. And even if they did speak up, you would likely be disappointed and start complaining. It was essential not to let Mark's spirit break under her constant jabs, especially when the restaurant was finally turning around. That's why I kept quiet too. But I really wish she had refused when Daniel and his family were coming back. Probably Mark thought it was work-related and agreed without thinking much, I admitted. Mom, Linda, I'm sorry. This situation is my fault for not being decisive enough. If I had managed the restaurant well from the start, Linda wouldn't have had to lend her money. And if I wasn't such a weakling, I could have told you the truth. If Linda decides to close the restaurant, then that's it. But what about the part-time workers? Mark said. Don't worry. In the past 2 weeks, I've already informed everyone about closing the restaurant, and they've all understood. For those interested, I've arranged part-time work at other restaurants through my IT consulting contacts, I assured. That's a relief. So everyone was in on this, Linda showing me an empty restaurant as a surprise, and everyone keeping the closure from me. My mother-in-law asked. Mark, I'm sorry too. I've been pressuring you and Linda. I'm sorry for everything up to now. I won't tell you to leave again. My mother-in-law apologized, and it seemed as if everything was resolving nicely. But that's a misunderstanding. I'm far from being satisfied, and the discussion is far from over. Let's settle this matter next, I said, pulling out divorce papers. What's this? A divorce paper? Mark picked up the papers in shock. Why a divorce? This is supposed to be a reconciliation, right? Don't just assume we've reconciled. You might think it's a secret, but I know about your affair with the part-timer. All the part-time workers knew about it too. I said, displaying an image on my smartphone sent by a part-time worker showing Mark entering a hotel. Anyone can take such evidence, not just the police or detectives. Getting the second branch back on track gave you too much confidence. You really got carried away, I concluded. I remarked that as the owner of the restaurant, I couldn't just stand aside from the day-to-day operations. Even though I couldn't do much in terms of daily management, I made it a point to visit from time to time. During these visits, the part-time workers complained to me about Mark's affair and asked for my help. When I promised to handle it, they provided incredible support. They leaked information about Mark's affair, sent me proof, and even kept silent about the restaurant's closure from him. Wait a minute, closing the second branch and a divorce? What's going to happen to the rent for this place? My mother-in-law's voice shook. I haven't mentioned that yet. I've been paying the entire rent of $10,000 a month for this house. Is that also true? Mark's shoulders slumped. It's true. When the restaurant's revenue started falling, Linda started paying half of it. But as revenue continued to drop, the amount she had to cover increased. Eventually, I ended up paying it all, $10,000 a month. It's the same as my salary, so I paid all the rent. And Mark covered other living expenses like food and utilities. So if Mark gets divorced and only has the main restaurant left, obviously living here won't be an option anymore, I stated matter-of-factly. Mark and my mother-in-law seemed deflated after hearing my words. They slumped as if they had exhausted themselves in a boxing match. Daniel and his wife, now somewhat understanding the situation, hesitantly joined the conversation. What does that mean? We came back here, can't live here? Sorry, Daniel. Right now, I don't have the means to help you with a restaurant or a house, Mark explained. Come on, do something. We're having a baby, at least give me a job. We have enough part-time, Daniel protested. The argument escalated, and it became clear that the future was uncertain for everyone involved. Witnessing the brothers dispute over their mother, the mother-child relationship also deteriorated. Now Mark and his mother are living together reluctantly in a smaller apartment, hardly talking and creating an awkward atmosphere. After the divorce, I first dealt with closing down the restaurant. It was a bit of a hassle, but as the owner, it was my responsibility. However, the fridge, cooking equipment, tables, and chairs I had removed were fairly new, so I managed to sell them at a good price. Adding just a little more money allowed me to finish the restaurant's closure, I recounted. Though it was a brief period, being a restaurant owner and handling its closure was an experience. I believe these experiences will be useful in my IT consulting work someday. I guess work suits me better than marriage. Convinced of this, I continue to work hard today. After the tumultuous events that unfolded, the conclusion of this saga brought a mix of resolution and uncertainty. I continued. The revelation of the true ownership of the restaurant, coupled with the exposure of Mark's affair, exposed the fractures in the family. The decision to close the second branch of the restaurant added a layer of financial stress and uncertainty about the future. Despite the apologies, it became clear that reconciling the strained relationships would be a complex and ongoing process, I added. The introduction of divorce papers, a decisive move by Linda, added another layer of complexity to this situation. The betrayal of trust both in the marriage and the business became a pivotal point that left the characters grappling with the aftermath. Linda's firm stance indicated that she was unwilling to overlook the breach of fidelity and was determined to take control of her life, even if it meant ending the marriage, I noted. As the fallout extended to Daniel and his family, the once close ties between the brothers strained, revealing the fragility of familial bonds under pressure. The uncertainty about living arrangements and financial stability left everyone involved facing an uncertain future. The emotional toll of the conflicts was palpable, as seen in the strained relationships and the awkward atmosphere that settled over the characters, I explained. In the end, the story leaves us with a sense of closure regarding the restaurant's closure and Linda's decision to end her marriage. However, it also leaves many questions unanswered about the characters' futures and whether they can rebuild their lives and relationships after the storm that shook the foundations of their family. The resolution, while bringing some clarity, marks the beginning of a new chapter for each character as they navigate the aftermath of the choices made and the consequences faced, I concluded.